Inspector Purbright and the Man Who Met Hitler. BBC alternate history drama. On Tuesday mornings, the town of Flaxborough had the decency to be dull. The baker's van hummed along the high street. The vicar's bicycle leaned faithfully against the post office wall, and the pigeons, that tireless civic committee, held their daily congress over the cobblestones. The week had not yet decided whether to be cold or merely indifferent. In the back room of the Liberal Club, a small gathering of bridge players had been laboriously miscounting trumps when Ernest Vowles, retired travel agent and quiet irritant, laid down his cards and said quite distinctly, "I once met Adolf Hitler." For a moment no one spoke. The clock ticked with an authority no one wished to challenge. Mrs. Pomeroy, who prided herself on never being surprised, smiled faintly.
"In a dream, dear?"
she asked. Vowles shook his head.
"In Harrogate?"
"November of '38, I was working at the Grand Hotel. He was there, under another name, of course." "Was he now?" murmured Reverend Cork, examining his hand.
"I dare say he looked well for his age." A little laughter broke the tension.
Vowles joined in politely, though his eyes did not. Outside, the afternoon dimmed early, the air tinged with the faraway smell of soot. When the game ended, Vowles rose, adjusted his tie, and left his sherry glass unemptied. Mrs. Pomeroy noted this with satisfaction. Proof, in her mind, of eccentricity confirmed. By dusk, the town had heard. By 9, the story had grown teeth. Some said Vowles had a signed letter, others that he kept a photograph locked away. A few, remembering the war too clearly, muttered that some things were better left unsaid. At 10:15, in his sitting room on Cherry Orchard Lane, Ernest Vowles sat listening to the wireless. The announcer's voice, calm and unbothered, spoke of fog at Dover and a parliamentary inquiry into rising bread prices. The gas fire flickered low. The milk bottles on the step would not be brought in next morning. When Mrs. Pomeroy came to return his umbrella the next day, she found the curtains still drawn. The wireless murmured on, a steady, ghostly presence. Ernest Vowles was seated as though in conversation, one hand resting on the arm of the chair, the other half curled around a pipe that had gone cold. Dr. Hilliard, summoned promptly, pronounced it a peaceful passing. The constable who assisted noticed nothing amiss, save a faint, unfamiliar scent, tobacco, of a darker blend than the old man ever smoked. That evening, Inspector Purbright, who disliked mysteries that arrived before lunch, looked up from his paperwork as the report came in. He read it twice, quietly, then reached for his hat. Outside, the fog was beginning to rise. By the next morning, Flaxborough had dressed its curiosity in mourning clothes. The blinds along Cherry Orchard Lane remained half lowered, a polite gesture that concealed an eager vigilance. People spoke softly of Ernest Vowles, but their whispers travelled briskly, carried on the chill breeze that funneled through the market square and into the tea-rooms. The general conclusion was that he had gone suddenly, which in Flaxborough was both a euphemism and a relief. Mrs. Pomeroy, claiming civic duty, paid a second visit to the house, this time bringing custard creams and 2 questions too many. She was met by Constable Malley, who informed her that the inspector had taken charge and that visitors were not precisely welcome. Mrs. Pomeroy, thwarted but unbowed, returned to the high street, where her silence became instantly productive. By lunchtime, Vowles' death had acquired 3 versions, each more adorned than the last. At the greengrocer's, it was said he had been writing a book about the Führer's English holiday. At the chemist's, that he had once been questioned by the ministry. The hairdresser, never to be outdone, reported that Vowles had hidden a letter, signed with initials no one dared to repeat. Miss Lucilla Teal, a retired librarian of formidable poise, listened to all this with weary authority. She had known Vowles for 20 years, and like most who knew him, alternated between irritation and affection. Over tea at the Golden Cup Cafe, she told her companion that the late Mr. Vowles was not entirely fanciful. Her tone, as always, implied reluctant fairness. He kept a scrapbook, you see. Photographs, newspaper clippings, odd postcards. I catalogued it once for him, rather a mess of glue and grand illusion. But there was one item I remember distinctly, a small black and white photograph of men in uniforms. He said it was taken in Harrogate. I told him that was improbable. He said, "Improbable things are the only ones that endure." I confess I didn't understand him then. Her companion, Mrs. Pewter, widened her eyes and lowered her voice.
And you think he really met?
Miss Teal cut her off gently. I think he liked to be believed. At the police station, Purbright read over the constable's report. Nothing disturbed the ordinary. The cause of death was consistent with a weak heart. Yet there lingered that matter of the smoke, its faint, foreign scent, and the curious absence of a framed photograph, the wall showing a lighter patch of wallpaper where it had once hung. Purbright had requested the removal of the body to the mortuary, and now sat with his hands folded, watching the slow accumulation of small oddities that rarely explained themselves at once. Sergeant Love entered with a note of satisfaction. "No signs of break-in, sir. Door was locked." Key still in his coat pocket.
I'd say natural, if you'll forgive the word. Purbright nodded.
People often die naturally in unnatural circumstances. The sergeant frowned but said nothing. Outside, the afternoon had turned to drizzle, flattening the colour from everything. Through the misted window, Purbright could see the blurred shapes of townsfolk crossing the square, huddled against the damp. He imagined the conversations already forming, how Vowles' peculiar boast would soon become posthumous legend. In Flaxborough, scandal aged quickly into folklore. That evening, Miss Teal took a slow walk home along Bridgegate. She paused beneath the lamplight, gloved hands folded around her shopping bag. Across the street, the windows of Vowles' house glowed faintly behind their curtains. She thought she saw a figure move, perhaps one of the constables finishing his inspection. Or perhaps, she told herself, imagination playing its usual trick. Still, the sight gave her pause. She had known loneliness well enough to recognize its stillness lingering in that house. Inside, the clock ticked untroubled. On a side table sat the scrapbook she had once catalogued, its binding cracked, the pages yellowing like autumn leaves. The constable on duty, bored and yawning, would later swear he'd closed it before leaving. Yet, when he returned the next morning, the scrapbook lay open, as though it had been read. In the market square, morning came again, damp and grey. The town's gossip, having exhausted Hitler, turned to Miss Teal. It was said she'd been seen near the house at dusk, that she had kept secrets for the dead man. The theory, like all Flaxborough theories, was tidy, comforting, and completely wrong. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, had written a short note to himself. Locate the missing photograph. It was the sort of instruction that seemed simple until one tried to obey it. He folded the paper neatly into his notebook, unaware that Miss Teal, 3 streets away, sat by her window holding a single black and white photograph, men in uniform, a hotel lobby, and one faintly familiar face at the edge of history. She turned it over once, sighed, and placed it carefully in an envelope addressed to no one. The rain began again, soft and steady, as if the town itself were trying to wash away the whisper it had started. Inspector Purbright arrived at Cherry Orchard Lane just after 10, his coat buttoned to the throat and his hat tilted modestly against the drizzle. The constable on duty greeted him with the relief of a man unsure what to notice. Inside, the air was close and faintly medicinal, the sort of stillness that lingers after too much care and too little company. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a thin, reluctant light that caught the dust in lazy motion. The sitting room, small and respectable, bore the careful order of an elderly man with routine for companionship. Everything was in its place, yet the room did not seem content with its arrangement. On the mantel, a line of family photographs, sepia faces long forgotten, stared with dutiful vacancy. Beside them, a small wooden pipe rack stood nearly full. Purbright leaned closer. The ashtray beneath was tidy, the last traces of tobacco pale and dry. But there, beneath the expected scent of Vowell's mild blend, lay another, richer, darker, foreign. He noted it quietly. The constable spoke with a tone that hoped to impress. Neighbours say he wasn't much of a talker, sir. Quiet as a mouse. Kept to himself. Purbright nodded absently, his gaze fixed on the far wall. An oval frame hung slightly off-centre, the nail above it bare, leaving a faint ghost of lighter wallpaper where a photograph had once been. Was this taken down for inspection? No, sir. It was like that when we came in. Purbright studied the small vacancy as one might study an accusation. And no photograph found elsewhere? Not a sign of it. We looked through the drawers, everything neat as a pin. The inspector turned his attention to the writing desk by the window. It bore a small stack of envelopes, one unsealed, its contents blank. A magnifying glass, its brass frame tarnished, lay beside a small notebook filled with half-legible jottings, lists of books, occasional German phrases, addresses that led nowhere. He closed it gently, careful not to disturb the impression of a man recently interrupted by death. Strange, he murmured, not to the constable but to the silence itself, for a man so orderly to misplace his own picture. He walked through the rest of the house at an unhurried pace. The kitchen was immaculate. A saucepan sat on the stove, washed and turned upside down to dry. In the bedroom, the bed was neatly made, slippers aligned with military precision. On the bedside table, a book of crossword puzzles lay open to a page unfinished. The pencil beside it had rolled just far enough to suggest distraction rather than intent. When he returned to the sitting room, the constable stood waiting, hat in hand. Doctor says heart failure, sir. Peaceful, he reckoned. Peaceful, yes, Purbright said softly, glancing once more at the empty frame. But was it content? He asked that no one enter the house for the remainder of the day. Later, when he stood again on the doorstep, the lane stretched before him in its damp respectability. Curtains shifted discreetly. A woman watering her begonias paused, pretending interest in the plants while observing him with quiet satisfaction. Flaxborough liked its mysteries gentle and well-behaved, preferably within walking distance. At the station, Purbright found Sergeant Love sorting the morning mail. "One letter for you, sir. Postmarked yesterday. No sender's name." He opened it with the care of a man unwrapping a memory. Inside lay a single newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle. It described, in solemn tone, a 1938 conference at the Grand Hotel. Harrogate. Distinguished guests from Europe attend private luncheon. Beneath the print was a faint pencil mark beside one name. E. Vowells, assistant. Grand Hotel. Purbright turned the paper over.
Nothing on the reverse.
He folded it again, slid it into his pocket, and stared briefly out the window. The rain had paused, though the air retained its damp promise. By afternoon, he had returned to Vowells's house. The constable, relieved to see him, offered tea. Purbright declined. He stepped once more into the sitting room, aware that rooms, like people, can lie when observed too soon. The faint scent of tobacco still lingered, neither strong nor fading, as though waiting to be recognized. He crouched near the hearth, running a finger along the grate's edge. A single flake of black ash clung to his glove, a type that burned slower and hotter than the blend in Vowell's pipe rack. He stood, brushing it off.
"You smoke, constable?"
"Only on weekends, sir." "Then you might know that's Balkan tobacco. Not something one finds in Flaxborough." The constable looked puzzled. "Travelling salesman, perhaps?"
"Or visitor," Purbright replied. The room answered with silence.
Outside, a lorry passed, its engine coughing against the damp. Somewhere down the lane, a dog barked once, indignant at the echo. As Purbright left, he paused on the doorstep. Across the road, behind her lace curtains, Miss Lucilla Teal stood motionless, a cup in her hand. Their eyes met briefly. an acknowledgement rather than a greeting. He tipped his hat. She returned the gesture with a slight nod and retreated from view. He walked back toward the square, the faintest smile touching his lips. In Flaxborough, curiosity was expected to be polite, and Purbright had always been a courteous man. But beneath that civility, something had begun to stir. A mild, deliberate interest that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with the missing photograph, the Balkan smoke, and the odd persistence of stories people preferred not to believe. By the time he reached the police station, dusk had fallen again, soft and deliberate. The inspector hung his coat, lit his lamp, and opened his notebook. On a fresh page he wrote, in neat and steady script, "Begin again with the truth everyone agrees upon and see where it starts to lie." He leaned back, listening to the faint hum of the wireless drifting in from the outer office. It played an old tune, something post-war and resigned, the sort of music that seemed to understand the town better than its people did. Purbright closed his eyes for a moment, the scent of tobacco still clinging faintly to his memory, and thought, very quietly, that peaceful deaths seldom arrived without company. By Thursday, the story had settled itself into something agreeable. Ernest Vowles had died quietly, without disturbance or embarrassment, which in Flaxborough was the nearest thing to civic virtue. The doctor's certificate used the phrase heart failure. The vicar preferred God's mercy, and Mrs. Frowes, whose opinions travelled faster than her groceries, declared it the inevitable outcome of too much solitude and not enough pudding. Each explanation, though tidy, was chosen more for comfort than conviction. In the high street, conversation turned domestic again. The draper had a new line of winter coats. The greengrocer had acquired a consignment of imported apples. Yet beneath the small talk ran the steady hum of satisfaction that mystery, once awkwardly introduced, had now been escorted to the door. Even the bridge club met again, Mrs. Pomeroy resuming her seat where Vowles had once sat, remarking with gentle relief that his absence made the room less draughty somehow. Inspector Purbright listened to all this from a quiet corner of the police station, where the kettle clicked and the clock marked out the hour with obstinate cheerfulness. Reports arrived in neat stacks, all consistent, all reasonable. Dr. Hilliard's notes were concise, no bruising, no struggle, nothing foreign in the stomach. A case, if not closed, then certainly folded. And yet, reasonableness was precisely what troubled him. It arrived too soon, too easily. Flaxborough's residents had accepted Vowles' death as they might a change in bus schedule, mild inconvenience followed by contented adaptation. Purbright had seen it before, how small towns protected their stillness by polishing away anything that might disturb it. After lunch, he walked down to the churchyard. The vicar, a round man with a fondness for sympathetic phrasing, was overseeing the placement of lilies by the gate. "A gentle soul," he said, lowering his voice as though addressing the departed directly. "One imagines his heart simply tired of waiting for company." Purbright nodded politely. He had company enough in memory, I think. The vicar smiled, uncertain whether it was agreement or correction. "We all have our memories, Inspector, some kinder than others." "Indeed," Purbright replied, "and some more persistent." He left the vicar pondering this and continued toward Cherry Orchard Lane. The house stood unchanged, its curtains now fully drawn, its silence newly acquired. He let himself in, more from habit than expectation, and stood once more in the small sitting room. The scent of tobacco had faded but not vanished. Dust had begun its patient reclamation. The oval frame on the wall remained empty, a pale ellipse against the wallpaper, like the outline of a vanished thought. He walked to the writing desk and opened the drawer again. The notebook was gone. So too the blank envelope he remembered. There was, however, a faint indentation on the wood where the notebook had rested, a detail too ordinary to mention, but too deliberate to ignore. Someone had tidied. Someone who preferred conclusions tidy as well. Back in town, he stopped at the grocer's to buy tea, a pretext that seldom failed. Mrs. Frowes served him with an air of condescending sympathy. "Terrible thing, poor Mr. Vowles," she said, weighing the tea with decisive precision. "Though not unexpected. Lonely men always come to a quiet end. It's the still ones you must watch. Stillness means surrender." Purbright smiled mildly. "You seem to have given it some thought." "Experience, Inspector. My husband, before he went, had that same look, like he'd already agreed with the doctor before being diagnosed." She paused, lowering her voice. "Of course, some say he might have done it himself. Not on purpose, mind you, just forgot to care. That's a sort of suicide, isn't it?" "Only if one believes forgetting is a choice," Purbright replied. Mrs. Frowes, uncertain whether she'd been corrected, offered a scone to recover. He declined with thanks and left her to the satisfaction of having conversed with the police. That evening, the fog returned, heavier this time, pressing the street lamps into small islands of amber light. From his office window, Purbright watched the mist drift past like a slow procession of unspoken thoughts. Sergeant Love entered, holding a file. "Nothing more on the Vowles business, sir?" "Doctor's report confirms all's as we thought." "Which is precisely what troubles me," Purbright said without looking up. "The world rarely arranges itself so neatly." Love hesitated. "Still, a clean ending's a blessing now and then." "Perhaps," said Purbright. "But I've never known one to last." When the sergeant had gone, he opened his notebook. On the page beneath the clipped article from Harrogate, he added a new line. "Every explanation is an attempt at comfort." He closed it gently, leaned back, and listened to the faint creak of the building settling into its evening quiet. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell struck 8. He thought again of Miss Lucilla Teal, her watchful eyes behind the lace curtain, and the empty frame waiting patiently in that silent room. He did not yet know what connected them, only that someone, had moved too carefully for chance. Flaxborough, he knew, disliked disorder, but sometimes, in its eagerness for peace, it buried the truth alive. Friday morning arrived with a thin, exhausted light that made Flaxborough look as though it were holding its breath. The fog had lifted during the night, leaving behind damp pavements and a faint metallic tang in the air. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, the familiar sound of the typewriter clattering somewhere down the corridor, and considered the sum of what he did not know. A man had died quietly, perhaps naturally, yet something in the rhythm of it all resisted finality. It was as though the story itself had been trimmed too neatly, its rough edges smoothed by invisible hands. When the telephone rang, it was with the hesitant urgency of someone rehearsing their courage.
"Inspector Purbright."
"You may not recall me, but we met at the Historical Society dinner last year." Lionel Hesketh, local historian, sort of. Purbright remembered him vaguely, a small, spry man with spectacles that caught the light like a guilty conscience. "I wondered," Hesketh continued, "if you'd heard about Ernest Vowles mentioning a letter? He told me once, years ago, that he possessed something rather singular. A letter signed with the initials A.H. Naturally, I assumed he meant someone else entirely. Harold, perhaps. But he was rather insistent." Purbright's pencil paused. "Did he say what it concerned?" "Oh, some matter of recognition, I believe. He claimed it was written after an encounter in Harrogate, before the war."
"I thought it absurd at the time, but, well, given the talk around town."
"Do you recall what became of it?" "Nobody did say once that it wasn't safe to show people. He rather enjoyed being mysterious, I think." Purbright thanked him, wrote the initials carefully in his notebook, and sat for a long moment before telephoning the records office in Leeds. Within an hour, he had a name. Gerald Pike, former journalist, once of the Yorkshire Post, now resident in a seaside boarding house following a scandal involving forged interviews. Pike had been an acquaintance of Vowles during the late 30s. By afternoon, Purbright was on the train north. The countryside slipped past in its November greys, hedgerows dripping, fields half drowned in mist, everything leaning slightly toward decay. Pike's lodgings were as expected, a narrow building smelling faintly of overcooked cabbage and cheap polish. The man himself opened the door with the caution of one long practiced in disappointment. Inspector Purbright, Flaxborough Constabulary. Pike squinted, then smiled faintly.
I haven't heard that name in years.
Come in, though I can't promise warmth. The landlady's at war with the gas meter. The room was lined with books and yellowed cuttings, their edges curling like dried leaves. A kettle steamed weakly on the hearth. Purbright took the proffered chair. "You knew Ernest Vowles," he began. "Knew him?"
I owe him an apology, if that counts.
He was the kind of man who remembered too much, always thought the truth had a moral shape to it. I told him once that morality was what editors invented to fill space. Did he ever speak to you about a conference in Harrogate, 1938? Pike's expression shifted. Ah, that old phantom. Yes, he did. I was covering the town council then, dull as tepid tea. But there was something that year, a gathering at the Grand Hotel. Officially, it was a cultural exchange, businessmen and academics. Unofficially, well, let's say admiration for the Führer wasn't yet a disqualification for polite company. Vowles worked there as a junior clerk. He swore blind he'd met the man himself, said Hitler travelled under another name for discretion. Most laughed.
I didn't. Because you believed him?
Because I saw the guest register. The name was missing from the printed list, but there was an extra suite booked in cash, initials only, A.H. He poured tea into 2 chipped cups. A year later, the war began.
Everyone forgot. Vowles didn't. He told me he'd kept a letter from that visit, though I never saw it.
Said it proved something, that the world had almost gone another way. He grew nervous in later years. Claimed someone wanted it back. Purbright listened, the whistle of the kettle soft beneath the words.
And who might that someone have been?
Pike shrugged. Take your pick. There were Englishmen then, respectable, titled, who'd have burned their own letters before letting them surface. Some still around, I shouldn't wonder. They spoke for another half hour, the air thickening with tobacco and memory. When Purbright finally rose to leave, Pike stopped him with a dry laugh. You know, Inspector, Vowles once said the past is like smoke. It never disappears, only hides in the curtains. Mind you, he was drinking at the time. Outside, the evening had turned raw, the sea wind carrying a faint salt sting. On the return train, Purbright watched his reflection in the dark window, an unmoving figure among shifting lights. The initials A.H. echoed in his thoughts, less as revelation than as confirmation of something already half known. By the time he reached Flaxborough, night had settled completely. The streets gleamed under the lamplight, wet and hushed. He walked from the station, past the shuttered shops and the solitary glow of Miss Teal's window. She was reading, or pretending to. The light went out as he passed. At the police station, Sergeant Love looked up from his paperwork. "Quiet night, sir. You find what you were after." "Only questions," Purbright replied, removing his coat, "but they're of better quality than before." He placed the folded notes from Pike into his file, then unlocked the small evidence box containing Vowles' personal effects. Inside lay the man's spectacles, his watch, and a worn fountain pen. Beneath them, half concealed by the inventory sheet, a faint smear of dark ash, foreign, persistent. He brushed it with his thumb, and the scent rose again, unmistakable. He sat back, closing the box gently. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then was silent. The missing photograph, he thought, was no longer just an absence. It was the key to a story the town had agreed never to tell. By Saturday morning, Flaxborough had resumed its customary decency, that outward calm by which provincial England shields itself from the notion of consequence. Yet beneath its quiet surfaces, small ripples had begun to disturb the water. The story of Ernest Vowles, though officially concluded, was refusing to die politely. It lingered in corners, in the careful silences exchanged at the post office counter, in the pause before conversation turned elsewhere. Something, no one could say precisely what, had unsettled the balance. At the town hall, the mayor's secretary, Miss Peggy Blount, arrived early. She was a capable woman with tidy handwriting and a nervous habit of over-polishing her spectacles. That morning, however, she did not begin with correspondence. Instead, she unlocked a small cabinet in the mayor's anteroom, withdrew a faded folder marked Civic Hospitality 1938, and carried it briskly to the staff lounge, where a small gas fire hissed faintly. She looked at the folder for a long moment, her reflection faint in the glass frame above the hearth, before striking a match. The papers curled almost soundlessly, edges turning to black lace. She watched until the last corner collapsed into ash, then stirred it gently with the poker, her expression one of careful composure. By mid-morning, the smell of smoke drifted faintly through the corridor,
mingling with the scent of polish and paper.
When the mayor arrived, cheerful and pink from breakfast, she was already at her desk, her spectacles immaculate. Purbright, meanwhile, spent the morning in the market square. He moved without haste, nodding to acquaintances, pausing at stalls. His questions, when they came, were folded neatly into conversation. An inquiry about the weather here, a mention of Vowles passing there. The replies were as predictable as the rain. Yes, a pity. Yes, he'd been a bit strange.
Yes, of course, they're hot.
Yet something curious happened when he let the name Hitler slip lightly, as one might mention a historical figure of mild irrelevance. The air shifted.
Eyes flickered. Smiles tightened.
At the butcher's, the knife paused mid-cut. At the tea shop, the waitress forgot the sugar. Even the vicar's wife, usually immune to discomposure, looked briefly as though she had bitten into something unripe. It was not outrage, Purbright noticed, but unease, a faint, inherited discomfort, as if the past itself might still be listening. He noted it all, silently. That afternoon at the Flaxborough Arms, a retired colonel by the name of Barrington had begun drinking earlier than custom allowed. He was a solid man of the old persuasion, his moustache trimmed like a regimental flag, and his opinions polished through long repetition. Purbright found him in the lounge, engaged in the delicate art of pretending not to remember names. "Inspector?" the colonel said, recognizing him belatedly.
"Damn shame about Vowles."
Decent chap in his way. Bit too fond of foreign notions, mind you. Foreign notions? Purbright's tone was mild. Oh, you know, talking up the Germans before the war. Harmless nonsense, of course. Half the town went through a phase.
Everyone thought they'd put Britain back in order.
Till they didn't. He swallowed the rest of his drink and waved for another. You can't hold a man's mistakes against him forever. War sorted that out, did it? Purbright asked quietly. The colonel looked up, blinking. Well, what's that?
I said war sorted that out. Ah, yes, yes.
Quite right. He forced a laugh, but it came out brittle. Anyway, Vowles was harmless. He never quite forgave himself, I think.
Always looked like a man waiting for the verdict. When Purbright left, the colonel was pouring another. Outside, the rain had returned, light but persistent, flattening the town into soft reflections.
Purbright walked toward the library, where he found Miss Lucilla Teal at her desk, arranging books with careful, unnecessary precision. She greeted him without surprise. "You've
been asking questions," she said. "I often do," he
replied, "about the past, mostly."
"Because it refuses to stay there." She closed the drawer and looked up. "People here forget selectively, Inspector."
"It's a kindness we extend to ourselves." "And then tell me, Miss Teal, was Vowles's kindness of the same sort?" Her composure held for a moment, then faltered. He remembered too much. He thought truth was like a photograph, once captured, never entirely lost. Yet his photograph is missing. She met his gaze evenly. Then perhaps someone else has learned the art of forgetting. He thanked her and left her to her silence. Outside, the street lamps were beginning to bloom against the gathering dusk. Back at the station, he reviewed his notes by lamplight. The pages, when spread out, resembled less a case file than a pattern of omissions. Every line of inquiry seemed to end where it should have begun. A burned file, a missing notebook, a silence too deliberate to be accidental. The past had been tidied, competently, collectively. He lit a cigarette, the smoke rising in slow, deliberate spirals. The scent triggered an image, the faint trace of Balkan tobacco in Vowles's sitting room. He turned the ashtray absently, watching the ember dim. Someone in Flaxborough had once smoked the same blend, someone who had sat close enough to a dying man to leave a trace. He rose and crossed to the window. The street outside lay almost deserted, the drizzle silver in the lamplight. Across the square the town hall loomed, its windows faintly aglow. For a moment he thought he saw a shadow move behind the curtain of the mayor's office, a quick, uncertain shape. Then it was gone. He returned to his desk and wrote in his notebook, each word slow and deliberate. The town behaves as if history were contagious. A knock interrupted him. Sergeant Love entered, a folded memo in hand. "Letter for you, sir. Arrived in the evening post. No return address." Purbright unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, female, deliberate. "You will find what you seek in what was never recorded, no signature. Only faintly visible beneath the ink, a watermark. Town Hall Stationery, Flaxborough." Purbright looked up, his expression unreadable.
"Thank you, Sergeant."
That will be all for tonight. When he was alone again, he placed the letter beside the burned folder's reference number he had copied earlier, Civic Hospitality, 1938. The two lay together like mirror images of the same omission. Outside, the rain thickened into steady rhythm. Somewhere in the distance, a clock struck 10. Purbright remained motionless, the lamp casting a small circle of gold about him. Within it, he saw not conspiracy exactly, but something subtler, fear, pride, and guilt braided into the quiet respectability of the town. Each face he had seen that day, each silence, had been part of the same design, an old truth, buried politely and guarded by those who still believed courtesy could outlast history. He closed the notebook with a soft click. Tomorrow, he decided, would begin with a visit to the town hall. Not an official one, just a polite inquiry. In Flaxborough, politeness had always been the sharpest tool of all. The morning broke in pale increments, the kind of light that arrived reluctantly, as though uncertain whether to bother. Flaxborough looked rinsed and worn, its shop front slick from the night's rain. Inspector Purbright stood by his office window, the anonymous letter from the previous evening still open on his desk. The man who met Hitler told the truth. 8 words, written in the steady hand of someone who wanted to be believed, but not known. The stationery was ordinary, ruled and faintly yellowed. The envelope, however, had been sealed with a small square of red wax, an oddly archaic touch that struck Purbright as deliberate. He read the line again, then folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with the others, documents of uncertainty, filed by instinct rather than evidence. Sergeant Love entered, his face half creased with sleep. "Morning, sir." "You're early?" "Couldn't sleep," Purbright said lightly. "Thought I'd keep company with the ghosts." The sergeant raised an eyebrow.
"Any progress with them?"
"They're good at withholding information," Purbright replied, adjusting his cuffs. "But they do enjoy being watched." They shared a brief, dry smile before settling into the day's routine. Reports, signatures, silence. Yet behind the small bureaucracy of Flaxborough law, something fragile was shifting. The letter's tone lingered in the air, subtle as perfume. It was not a taunt. It felt like a warning offered by someone half afraid to give it. By late afternoon, clouds had thickened again, and the town moved under a dim, bruised sky. Purbright made a circuit of the square, stopping at the post office, the library, and finally the town hall, where the mayor's secretary greeted him with composed politeness. "Inspector?" she said, folding her hands. What a surprise. I'm full of them, he replied mildly. I was hoping to see the mayor. Out of town today, I'm afraid. Business in Lincoln, of course. Purbright's gaze drifted toward the desk behind her. The paper tray was empty, but a faint trace of ash clung to its edge as though something had been hastily brushed away. I won't keep you, Miss Blount. Do give him my regards. She smiled with professional gentleness, but her eyes wavered, just for a moment, toward the waste bin. When Purbright left, the corridor behind him smelled faintly of burnt paper and lavender polish. That evening, the wind returned,
rattling the eaves and sending the last of the autumn leaves scudding along the cobblestones.
The station was quiet, its lights a muted amber against the fog. Purbright had stayed late again, reviewing the meagre evidence as if repetition might turn it into revelation. Love had gone home an hour earlier, leaving behind a thermos of tea and a note that said, "Try to sleep sometime, sir." It was nearing midnight when the first sound came, a soft click, like a latch drawn with careful fingers. Purbright looked up from his papers. The corridor light outside his office flickered once, then steadied. He rose slowly, listening. There it was again, a whisper of movement, measured, deliberate. He crossed to the door, opened it an inch, and waited. The air beyond was cool and still, yet faintly disturbed. He moved quietly down the hall toward the records room. The faint glow of the single safety lamp spilled across the floor. The door was ajar. Inside, drawers stood open, papers scattered like fallen leaves. A figure was bent over the evidence cabinet, tall, slender, dressed in a dark trench coat. The hat was pulled low, obscuring the face. The hand that moved over the files wore a glove, small and precise. "Looking for something in particular?" Purbright said softly. The figure froze. For a moment, silence filled the space between them like held breath. Then, without haste, the intruder turned, just enough to catch the faint light across the brim of the hat, and moved swiftly toward the rear door. Purbright stepped forward, but the figure was already gone, vanishing into the dark corridor with the ease of someone who knew the building's bones. By the time he reached the yard, the back gate was swinging on its hinges. He caught a glimpse only, a silhouette against the fog, coat flaring slightly in the wind. The line of a woman's stride unmistakable. Moments later, Sergeant Love came pounding down the stairs in his shirt sleeves.
"Sir, I heard the door. What happened?" "An intruder," Purbright said calmly.
They were after something in the records. They returned to the room together. The cabinet containing Vowles's personal effects had been forced open. The spectacles and watch remained, but the scrapbook was gone. Love whistled low. "That's the only thing missing," Purbright nodded. "Then we can assume they knew exactly what they wanted." He crouched by the cabinet, inspecting the lock. It had been picked, not broken. "Skilled," he murmured. "And cautious." The sergeant looked uneasy. "You got a look at them?"
"Only the outline. A woman."
"Tall by the stride. Wore a trench coat." Love blinked.
"Like Miss Teals, sir?"
Purbright didn't answer. Instead, he rose and looked toward the window. The fog outside pressed close, swallowing the faint reflections of the street lamps. "She knew where to find it," he said quietly, "and how to leave without being seen." They spent another hour taking inventory, though the result was already certain. When Love had gone to write the report, Purbright stood alone in the corridor, the silence deep enough to hear the creak of old timber and the faint hiss of the lamps. He thought of the anonymous letter, the phrasing precise, the handwriting careful, the wax seal deliberate. The same sort of care one might use when sealing away a truth too long hidden. Back in his office, he poured the last of the tea into his cup. It was cold, metallic. He set it down and took out the letter once more, holding it under the light. The red wax gleamed faintly, catching the glow of the lamp. He turned it in his hand, and a small fleck of something dark clung to his thumb. Ash. Very fine. He brushed it away and sat for a long while, unmoving. Somewhere in Flaxborough, a woman had risked more than curiosity for that scrapbook. It was not greed that drove her, nor fear. It was preservation. The difference, Purbright thought, was crucial. Preservation meant belief. Outside, the street was empty, the town sunk in its habitual sleep. The lamplight trembled faintly in the mist, and the first call of a bird came thin and early across the rooftops. In that uncertain half-hour before dawn, the inspector closed his notebook and wrote a single line beneath his previous entry. The truth, it seems, has finally remembered where it lives. Morning came pale and precise, as if the sky itself had been ironed into submission. Inspector Purbright arrived at the station early, his expression unreadable, his manner unhurried. The report from Sergeant Love lay neatly typed on his desk, concise, factual, and utterly useless. The scrapbook had vanished without a trace, the lock had been picked with surgical care, and no prints had been left behind. Whoever had broken in had done so not out of desperation, but with deliberation. Purbright read the report twice, then set it aside. He opened his notebook, where the anonymous letter still rested between the pages. The man who met Hitler told the truth. The phrasing had stuck with him all night, its curious mixture of certainty and pity. He suspected it had been written by someone who knew both the man and the truth rather well, and who now found herself haunted by both. He spent the morning quietly retracing his steps. At the library, Miss Teal was again behind her desk, calm as a portrait. She greeted him with polite civility, but without warmth.
"Inspector."
"You're becoming something of a regular reader." "I'm told history rewards persistence," he replied. Her lips curved faintly.
"And does it?"
"Not yet, but I live in hope." He glanced around at the shelves, then said, "We've had an incident. Someone entered the police station last night. Something of Mr. Vowles's was taken." Her hands paused over the date stamp.
"How dreadful."
"Do you know what?" "A scrapbook of photographs and clippings. You mentioned once that you'd seen it." "Yes, a rather confused affair, I thought." He was sentimental about the past in his fashion. "Would you say there was anything in it worth stealing?" She hesitated, her eyes fixed on the stamp in her hand, not unless one valued embarrassment. He was fond of odd souvenirs, postcards, signatures, things better forgotten. Forgotten by whom? She looked up sharply now.
"By everyone, Inspector."
"Some memories serve no purpose but to unsettle the living." He inclined his head. "That may depend on who's doing the remembering." Their exchange ended there, as gracefully as it had begun. Outside, the wind had shifted east, bringing a brightness that felt brittle rather than kind. Purbright walked toward the river, his thoughts turning slowly, methodically. The theft, the letter, the burned file. The silences, all separate threads of a single fabric, frayed by age and guilt. At noon, he called upon Dr. Hilliard under the pretext of reviewing the death certificate. The doctor, cheerful and florid, poured 2 cups of tea before answering questions he assumed had no real importance. "You're still at it, are you, Inspector?"
"Good man, good man."
But really there was nothing untoward. His heart simply stopped. "Peaceful as they come. I've no quarrel with your diagnosis," Purbright said.
"Only with the atmosphere surrounding it."
"Tell me, when you examined him, did you notice the pipe smoke?" "Of course. The man was a chimney. Not that kind, Doctor."
"A different blend, stronger, Balkan perhaps." The doctor frowned. "Can't say I did."
"My sense of smell's never been my pride." "War injury?" He tapped the side of his nose and chuckled. "Gas training 1917 ruined me for subtleties." Purbright thanked him and left. The conversation, though outwardly futile, had told him enough. Someone else had been there that night, someone confident enough to leave through the front door, unseen. By late afternoon, he had returned to the square. The light had taken on that peculiar golden brittleness that belonged only to English autumns, where beauty looked slightly guilty for persisting. He paused outside the Flaxborough Arms, watching as Colonel Barrington emerged, cane tapping unevenly against the pavement. The old soldier's face was ruddy with brandy and memory. "Ah, Inspector," he said grandly. Still chasing shadows, I hear?
Occasionally they lead to people, Purbright replied. Ha!
You won't find any worth chasing here. We're all perfectly respectable, God help us. The Colonel's laugh dissolved into a cough. Purbright waited for it to pass, then said lightly, You were stationed near Harrogate once, I believe. Barrington blinked.
Good Lord, how'd you— Oh, yes. Terrible dinners.
Decent golf, why? You might have attended a certain conference in 38, a private one. Hosted at the Grand Hotel conference? The Colonel's brow furrowed, then smoothed.
Can't recall. Might have been.
Dashed lot of meetings back then. Did you know Ernest Vowles? Barrington's eyes flickered. Knew of him.
Hotel staff, wasn't he?
Efficient chap. Brought up my luggage, I think.
Why was he, truthful? Said Purbright gently.
He claimed to have met a man he shouldn't have. By accident, not design. The Colonel's cane paused mid-tap.
That was a long time ago, Inspector.
Best left where it belongs. Purbright studied him for a moment. That seems to be everyone's policy. Barrington cleared his throat. Well, the war made fools of us all. Some of us sooner than others. He offered a curt nod and walked away, shoulders stiff. When he was gone, Purbright stood for a long while in the fading light, piecing together the fragments. Vowles, the clerk who met the wrong guest at the wrong time, a photograph that proved too much, a letter of gratitude from a man who had once shaken the world. It wasn't the meeting itself that frightened people. It was the idea that such a moment could have existed at all, ordinary and accidental inside the safe boundaries of England. That night, back at the station, he reviewed his notes once more. The narrative was emerging, faint but steady. Ernest Vowles had met Hitler by chance while working at the Grand Hotel in 1938. The photograph, later part of his scrapbook, had shown it plainly, a smiling young clerk in the background.
Unaware that history had brushed past him.
After the war, when the image resurfaced, someone had recognized themselves in its shadow, someone with reason to fear what remembrance might awaken. He imagined the scene, the visitor returning after years of silence, sitting in Vowles's modest room, the old man confused but unafraid, the faint smell of foreign tobacco in the air. A conversation, perhaps even an apology, followed by a quiet death that suited everyone's convenience. He did not yet know the name of the visitor, but he knew her shape, a woman of education, restraint, and resolve. Someone for whom the past was not an abstraction, but a personal trespass. The anonymous letter had not been written to conceal guilt. It had been written to confess it indirectly. He extinguished the lamp and looked out at the narrow street below. The town lay still, pinned beneath its usual decency. Yet now, he thought, that decency had begun to tremble. Flaxborough's order had always depended on its ability to forget. Now the oddity lay in remembering. The afternoon arrived with a chill that seemed to linger even indoors. The streets of Flaxborough were muffled beneath low grey light, and the faint hiss of rain against window panes lent the day a quiet unwillingness to continue. Inspector Purbright sat at his desk, the steam from his teacup rising in slow, deliberate spirals. Across from him, 2 cups were set, one untouched, one faintly steaming. He had sent a polite note that morning, handwritten, no official seal. Perhaps you might join me for tea at 4. There's a matter of remembrance, not accusation. It had been signed with the steady simplicity of a man who understood the weight of tone. At 4 precisely, Miss Lucilla Teal entered the station. She was dressed as she always was, elegant, exact, her coat neatly fastened, her gloves perfectly aligned, but there was something diminished about her composure, as though she had grown smaller within it. Purbright rose, motioned to the chair opposite, and said, "You're punctual as ever, Miss Teal, a quality increasingly rare." "I dislike lateness," she replied quietly. "It gives time too much advantage," he smiled faintly. "Milk and sugar?" "Just a little milk, thank you." For a while they spoke of nothing. The tea filled the silence, its warmth of fragile civility. "She mentioned the weather," he remarked upon the lateness of spring bulbs. But beneath the polite surface, something heavy and inevitable hovered, like the smell of rain on old paper. "I wanted to speak with you," Purbright said at last, his tone soft, conversational, almost apologetic. "About Mr. Vowles, or rather about something of his that's recently gone missing." Her gloved hands, resting on her lap, did not move.
"I heard there was an incident at the station. Yes, a break-in."
The thief took only one item, a scrapbook.
"I imagine you know the one." "I remember it," she said. "It contained a photograph," he continued.
A rather particular one. Taken in Harrogate, 1938, a group of men, mostly English, gathered for what was described as a cultural exchange. One of them, by peculiar accident, was the German Chancellor himself, and somewhere at the edge of that picture, a hotel clerk named Ernest Vowles. Does that sound familiar? Her eyes flickered once, then steadied. It does. Mr. Vowles, I believe, kept that photograph all his life, not for vanity, but as a small proof that his story had been true. He told a few people, not many. He said it was the only remarkable thing that had ever happened to him. And then, sometime after his death, the picture disappeared. She looked at him for a long moment, her voice calm when it came. "You seem very certain, Inspector." "I am," he said gently. "Because the lock on his cabinet was opened cleanly, not forced. Because the scent in that room wasn't his tobacco, but yours, the same faint blend you've used for years.
And because you were the only one who ever defended him when people laughed. It wasn't mockery you wanted to spare him from, Miss Teal. It was revelation." Her composure faltered then, not in her posture, which remained dignified, but in her breathing, shallow and uneven. "I took it," she said finally.
"I took it the day before his death. Did you visit him often?" "Occasionally. He was lonely, and I dislike seeing people reduced to ghosts while still alive. He showed me the scrapbook again, boasting, as always, but there was something fragile in it this time. He said he wanted people to know the truth before he died."
I tried to reason with him, told him the town had no appetite for history of that kind.
He wouldn't listen, so I took the photograph when he went to make tea.
"I thought it would spare him ridicule." "But it wasn't ridicule you feared," Purbright said softly. Her gaze lowered.
"No? Then perhaps you'll tell me whose shame you were protecting." There was a long pause, filled only by the faint ticking of the clock. When she spoke, her voice had lost its practiced precision. "My brother. You know him as Mayor Teal. In 1938 he was not yet so respectable. He fancied himself a man of influence, attended lectures, meetings, thought the German example admirable, order, pride, efficiency. He went to Harrogate with others from the county. He said it was only political curiosity. But I saw the letter of invitation once. It bore the same initials that haunted Mr. Vowles." She reached for her cup, then set it down again, untouched. "After the war, when all that was poison, my brother destroyed everything, letters, notes, the connections that had once seemed harmless. He rebuilt himself on the ashes, became civic, generous, beloved. But when Vowles began talking again, my brother grew afraid. He said people had short memories but shorter forgiveness."
I told him I'd handle it. I thought I could persuade Vowles to let it rest. Her voice broke faintly.
"When he died, I thought it was Providence. But when you began to ask questions, I realized Providence had help. I went to the station that night because I couldn't bear the thought of his scrapbook being catalogued, of that photograph surviving. I took it, burned it, and thought it would end there." Purbright watched her quietly. "Did your brother know what you'd done?" She shook her head.
"He suspects."
"But he won't ask." "That's how we live here, Inspector. We don't ask, we just make sure the curtains stay drawn." The room fell silent. Outside, the rain had begun again, soft against the panes. She dabbed her eyes with a folded handkerchief, not dramatically, but with the weary precision of someone long practiced in endurance. "I'm not ashamed of protecting him," she said, her voice trembling only slightly.
"He's done good for this town."
"People trust him. What good would it do to ruin that now?
Truth has its uses, Purbright said gently.
Though rarely the convenient ones. She gave a small, hollow laugh. You're kinder than I expected, Inspector.
I thought you'd accuse me. I could, he said.
But it would achieve nothing. Mr. Vowles is beyond embarrassment.
The photograph's gone.
And your brother will spend the rest of his life guarding an empty frame. That seems punishment enough. Her hands trembled slightly as she rose.
You won't tell anyone?
He met her eyes, steady and grave. I'll file it as a matter resolved through private correspondence. Officially, there will be no entry. Unofficially, the town will keep whispering, because towns like ours always do. But they'll never know which parts are true. She nodded slowly.
Thank you. When she reached the door, she paused.
For what it's worth, Inspector, Ernest Vowles really was kind. Foolish, but kind. He believed people could meet monsters and still remain innocent. Perhaps that was his mistake, Purbright inclined his head, or his redemption. She left without another word. The door closed softly behind her, and the faint echo of her footsteps faded down the corridor. Purbright poured himself another cup of tea. The rain continued, steady and unhurried. He sat for a long while, thinking not of crimes but of burdens, those quietly inherited, politely carried, and never truly put down. He reached for his notebook and wrote, in the same even hand as always, truth, when finally spoken,
asks for nothing but rest. The inquest took place on a Wednesday,
the kind of day that managed to be both damp and forgettable. The coroner, a mild man with an affection for brevity, read from his notes as though reciting a weather report. The deceased, Ernest Vowles, male, 78. Death attributed to cardiac failure consistent with age and general condition. No evidence of foul play. His tone made the final phrase sound almost apologetic. There were no murmurs from those assembled, only the soft creak of benches and the polite cough of inevitability. Inspector Purbright sat near the back, his hands folded neatly, his expression unreadable. He watched as the process of official closure unfolded, questions asked with precision, answers given with rehearsed modesty. The verdict, when announced, landed with all the gentle authority of a teacup placed firmly on a saucer. It was over. The town could resume its rhythm. Afterwards, the mayor approached him in the corridor, his manner amiable, his relief palpable. "Inspector," he said, grasping Purbright's hand with the warmth of a man publicly grateful for discretion, "I must commend you on the admirable restraint of your investigation."
A lesser man might have complicated things. Purbright returned the handshake, his voice calm.
Complication, in my experience, is rarely in short supply, Mr. Mayor. It's simplicity that tends to vanish first. The mayor chuckled politely, uncertain whether he was being corrected. Well said, well said. Still, I'm glad we can draw a line under it.
Poor fellow seemed harmless enough. Yes, Purbright said softly.
Harmless enough. The phrase lingered as he left the building, like a mild echo of irony. Outside, a thin fog had begun to gather, wrapping itself around the lampposts and softening the edges of the world. The town was settling comfortably back into its usual decency, its collective sigh almost audible. By early evening, Miss Lucilla Teal was alone in her drawing-room. The fireplace glowed with low, deliberate heat. She sat before it, the flames reflected faintly in her spectacles. On her lap lay an envelope, plain, unmarked, slightly smudged. She opened it, and for a long moment simply stared at what it contained. The photograph had been returned to her that morning, anonymously, slipped through her letterbox between the day's bills and a notice about the parish fete. It was smaller than she remembered, its edges brittle, its surface clouded by time. But there he was, Ernest Vowles, standing slightly off-centre in a hotel lobby, his youthful face earnest, his posture uncertain. And there, in the background, blurred, yet unmistakable, the figure of the man history had taught the world to fear. Two worlds caught in the same fraction of light. Lucilla traced the image with a gloved fingertip, as though trying to rub the moment away. Then she rose, crossed to the hearth, and fed the photograph carefully to the fire. The edges curled inward, the faces dissolving into one another, then into nothing. The room smelled briefly of old paper and smoke. She watched until the last ember dimmed, then closed the grate and sat back, her composure restored. At precisely 8 o'clock, her brother arrived. He entered without speaking, carrying his usual air of civic gravity. She poured tea without asking, and they sat together in a silence thick with practiced familiarity. "I saw the report," he said eventually. "It's finished." "Yes," she replied. He stirred his tea slowly, the spoon tapping once against the china. "You've been thoughtful lately. Should I not be?"
I'm only saying you've done enough, Lucilla.
"Whatever was or wasn't in that photograph is gone. Best for everyone. For you, perhaps," she said, her voice mild. He looked at her sharply. "For the town," he corrected. "Yes," she murmured, "for the town." They finished their tea in silence. When he left, she remained by the hearth, watching the slow, rhythmic dance of the coals. Her face was calm, but her eyes, reflected faintly in the glass of the cabinet opposite, looked older than before. Across town, Purbright walked home through streets glazed with fog. The lamps along the river shone like faint lanterns in a procession, their reflections stretching thinly across the wet cobblestones. He walked without haste, his thoughts quiet, his senses attuned to the peculiar stillness that follows any settled deceit. Flaxborough had returned to itself, or so it would seem. The gossip had softened into something resembling sympathy. The bridge club had resumed its game, now with a vacant chair politely ignored. The newspaper had printed its final note. Mr. Ernest Vowles, formerly of Cherry Orchard Lane, whose sudden passing caused much local regret, was yesterday laid to rest at St. Mark's Cemetery. Beneath it, no mention of photographs or conferences, only the usual blessings of remembrance. Purbright turned down a narrow lane, his breath forming small clouds in the air. The faint tang of coal smoke reached him from somewhere ahead, domestic, familiar, yet tinged with something older, almost historical. It carried with it the scent of the past being managed, burned carefully to ash. He paused outside his gate and looked back toward the town. The rooftops lay softened under fog, the church spire barely visible, the world reduced to outlines and half-truths. He thought of Miss Teal and her quiet confession, of her brother's carefully polished respectability, of the photograph that had now been erased for the second and final time. The story, as the coroner and the mayor would have it, was complete. But completeness, Purbright knew, was only another word for silence. He entered his cottage, hung his hat by the door, and lit the lamp. The glow filled the small room with its habitual warmth. On the mantel lay his notebook, still open to the last entry. Truth, when finally spoken, asks for nothing but rest. He read it again, then closed the cover gently, as one might close a door behind a departing guest. Outside, the fog thickened, folding over the town like a slow exhalation. From somewhere far off, a train whistle sounded, brief and mournful, before fading into distance. Purbright poured himself a modest measure of whisky, sat by the window, and watched the pale outlines of the world dissolve into the night. The town, he thought, had achieved what it always desired: order restored, faces composed, history rewritten in courteous tones, and yet, as the fog pressed closer, he felt the faintest whisper of disquiet, something in the air that smelled not only of coal, but of memory refusing to die. He raised his glass slightly toward the unseen rooftops and said,
half aloud, "Rest well, Mr. Vowles, you told the truth, even if no one wanted it." Then he drank, and the world outside blurred into stillness,
the night carrying on as if nothing at all had been disturbed. By the following week, Flaxborough had resumed its tidy, rhythmic breathing. The shop bells rang again with their usual optimism. The church clock struck the hour with a sense of calm authority, and the postman whistled tunelessly down the lane as if the world, after all, had agreed to behave itself. In the market, the fishmonger's jokes found their audience, and Mrs. Pomeroy once more pronounced loudly that nothing ever really happens here, thank heaven. The remark was greeted with the approving silence of people who had quietly edited recent memory into something manageable. Inspector Purbright sat by his window, the morning light settling in soft patches across his desk. His teacup rested beside a thin volume of poetry he had not truly intended to read. Outside, the street moved with its habitual purpose, the grocer sweeping his threshold, a boy wheeling a bicycle too large for him, a woman adjusting her hat before catching her reflection in the butcher's window. It was all reassuringly familiar, even if the familiarity carried a faint echo of denial. He watched it for a long time, the ordinary choreography of a town restored to itself. Yet somewhere beneath the polished surface of everyday life, something imperceptible had shifted. Perhaps it was in the way people lowered their voices near Cherry Orchard Lane, or in the unspoken haste with which the mayor's secretary crossed the square when Miss Teal appeared. Politeness endured, of course, it always did. But now it bore the faintest tremor, like porcelain that had been mended too neatly to be trusted. The telephone rang once, briefly, as if to remind him he still belonged to a profession rather than a reverie. It was Sergeant Love, cheerful as ever, reporting that the Vowles case files had been archived. "Everything put away neat and proper, sir," he said. "I imagine the man himself would have liked it that way." "I expect he would," Purbright replied. "Thank you, Sergeant." When he hung up, the silence of the room returned, deep and companionable. The wireless murmured softly in the corner, music from another decade, faintly crackling, the kind of melody that refused to acknowledge history's interruptions. It was the same tune that had been playing in Ernest Vowles's sitting room the night he died. The thought passed through Purbright's mind like a ripple, unwelcome but inevitable, and then was gone. He reached for his pipe, filled it with habitual care, and struck a match. The smoke rose gently, curling toward the ceiling in thin, contemplative threads. Through the faint haze, he could see the square beyond the window. The mayor crossed it just then, brisk and upright, his hat angled precisely, his step carrying the measured weight of a man restored to public ease. Behind him, Miss Teal walked slowly, carrying a basket of books toward the library. She paused once at the fountain, glancing over her shoulder, and for a moment Purbright thought she might look up toward his window. She didn't. The moment dissolved, as such moments often did, into the unremarkable business of continuing. He watched her go, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. He understood, more than she could guess, the quiet exhaustion of those who had chosen silence over scandal, protection over truth. There was a kind of dignity in it, though not one that history was inclined to reward. The fog of the previous nights had lifted, leaving the air sharp and clear. From somewhere beyond the churchyard came the sound of a hammer striking wood, perhaps a shopkeeper repairing a shutter, perhaps something simpler. Flaxborough was mending itself as it always did, carefully, invisibly, pretending no damage had ever been done. The post arrived. 2 circulars, a newspaper, and a letter addressed in a neat, feminine hand. Purbright turned it over once before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, unsigned. The writing was small and deliberate. "Thank you for leaving things as they were meant to remain. Some truths are better when shared only with the dead." He read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it in his drawer, alongside the earlier letter, the one that had begun it all. The two sat together now, one promising revelation, the other gratitude for restraint. Between them, he supposed, lay the full range of human honesty. The church clock struck 11. The sound carried gently through the open window, mingling with the faint rustle of the wind through the hedges. Purbright leaned back, his hands clasped loosely on his lap. The town was already forgetting again, reshaping its story into one that would fit comfortably within its boundaries. The past, he thought, had not been buried. It had simply been put back where it belonged, mislaid, politely. He imagined earnest Vowles as he must have been that last evening, sitting quietly before his wireless, content to be remembered for nothing, yet still unwilling to surrender the small truth that made his life seem larger. Perhaps he had known even then that the photograph would not outlast him, but perhaps he had trusted that someone someday would remember what it meant. Purbright smiled faintly at the thought, though there was little humour in it. He rose, crossed to the window and opened it a fraction. The air that entered was cool, edged with the scent of smoke and distant bread from the bakery. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked once, twice, and was hushed. The rhythm of Flaxborough carried on, measured, courteous, quietly incurious. He looked out across the square again, the same cobblestones, the same weary elegance, and thought how very little ever changed. The people moved through their routines with the serenity of those who had accepted forgetting as a civic duty. Yet beneath it all, he felt the pulse of something older, deeper, the stubborn persistence of memory, that faint vibration beneath the town's calm surface. The wireless shifted tune, the announcer's voice breaking in with practiced warmth. And now, for those at home this fine morning, a little music to accompany your peace. Purbright closed the window gently, letting the sound fade into the background hum of the room. He sat again, eyes resting on the empty teacup, the slow curl of pipe smoke rising beside it. The day moved forward, precise and unhurried, he thought, not without irony, that truth itself might envy such composure. Outside, the church bell tolled the quarter hour, and life in Flaxborough went on, modest, mannerly, and faintly incomplete. Thanks for watching the video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. The end.